The autumn of 1892 fell heavy on the Ozark Mountains. In the deep, isolated pockets of northwestern Arkansas, the world was a thing of stone, timber, and shadow. Progress was a distant rumor, a whisper carried on the wind from cities that felt as foreign as ancient Rome. Here, in the hollows carved by time and water, life was governed by older, more unforgiving laws. It was a world of folklore, of hardship, and of secrets buried so deep they became part of the land itself. On a crisp October afternoon, a 12-year-old boy named Silas Blackwood was chasing a runaway hound through a tract of forgotten woods his family had long since stopped farming. The air was thick with the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth, a smell as old as the mountains. The dog, baying with a strange mix of excitement and fear, led Silas further from the familiar paths, into a dense thicket of hickory and oak where the sunlight struggled to pierce the canopy. It was there in a small, unnatural clearing that the dog stopped. It stood, hackles raised, whining at the edge of a low, crumbling stone circle nearly swallowed by moss and ivy. In its center was a dark maw, a hand-dug well, its wooden winch rotted to splinters. An unsettling odor, sweet and foul, rose from its depths, a stench that clung to the back of the throat. It was not the smell of stagnant water or animal decay. It was something profoundly, terribly human. Silas, driven by a morbid curiosity that would haunt him for the rest of his life, crept to the edge. He peered into the darkness, his eyes struggling to adjust. What he saw first was a pale, floating shape like a waterlogged pillow, but then the shape resolved. It was a face bloated and white, its eyes open and vacant, and beneath it another, and another. The well was not filled with water. It was choked with the dead. The boy's scream was thin and sharp, swallowed by the immense, indifferent silence of the Ozark woods. He scrambled backward, tripping over roots, his mind unable to process the macabre tableau in the well. He ran, not looking back. The horrifying image burned into his memory. He didn't stop until the familiar sight of his family's smoke-stained cabin came into view, collapsing into his father's arms in a fit of incoherent sobbing. The Blackwood family, stoic and hardened by generations of mountain life, understood terror when they saw it. Jonas Blackwood, a man of few words and even fewer comforts, grabbed his hunting rifle and followed his son's trembling directions back to the clearing. He did not go alone. Word in the hollows traveled not by wire, but by foot and by instinct. Within the hour, a small party of grim-faced men stood at the edge of the hollow well, their lanterns cutting feeble paths through the encroaching dusk. The stench was now overpowering, a physical presence that made several of the younger men retch. Jonas, steeling himself, lowered a lantern tied to a rope into the abyss. The light swayed, illuminating a horrifying scene of tangled limbs and pallid flesh. The bodies were packed in so tightly it was impossible to tell where one ended and another began. They were in varying states of decay, suggesting they had not all been placed there at the same time. This was not the result of a single, violent act. It was a ledger of death, a repository of forgotten souls. The well, they would soon discover, was over 30 feet deep, and it was filled almost to the top. The silence among the men was absolute, broken only by the creak of the rope and the frantic buzzing of flies. They were standing on the edge of a mass grave, a place of forbidden history that had remained hidden, festering in the dark heart of their own land. County Sheriff Brody was a man weathered by the harsh realities of frontier justice. He had seen his share of violence, disputes over land, drunken brawls turned fatal, the desperate acts of starving men. But what he was summoned to in Blackwood Hollow was something outside his experience, something that felt ancient and wrong. Arriving 2 days later with a deputy and a town doctor, he found the site cordoned off by the local men, their faces masks of grim resolve. The area around the well had been trampled, but one thing was immediately clear. There was no sign of a struggle. No bloodstains on the surrounding rocks, no discarded weapons, no tracks indicating a frantic chase. It was as if the victims had simply walked to the edge and fallen in, or had been placed there with a chilling, methodical calmness. The recovery effort began under a sky the color of lead. Using grappling hooks and long poles, the men started the gruesome task of pulling the bodies from their watery tomb. The first one brought to the surface was a woman, her long dress of dark calico now a tattered shroud. Her identity was lost to the ravages of time and water. The second was a man, his face a ruin, but his hands were those of a laborer, thick with calluses. Then another, and another. Each body that emerged from the dark depths was a fresh wave of horror. Some were little more than skeletons, their bones tangled in rotting clothes. Others were more recent, their features eerily preserved by the cold, stagnant water. The doctor, a man named Alastair Finch, worked tirelessly, his face a pale, sweating canvas of professional detachment that did little to hide his revulsion. He counted 17. 17 souls, men, women, and even children, pulled from the obscene confines of the hollow well. Who were they? And more disturbingly, who could have done this? The community of Blackwood Hollow was small, insular, and fiercely private. A crime of this magnitude felt impossible. It was the work of a phantom, a monster that walked these hills unseen. The year 1892 was a time of immense change in America, but in the remote Ozark Highlands, time seemed to move at a different pace. This was a land of deep-seated traditions, where folklore held as much sway as law, and suspicion of outsiders was a creed passed down through generations. The people of these hollows were a breed apart, shaped by poverty, isolation, and a relentless struggle against an unforgiving landscape. They were Scots-Irish, English, and German immigrants who had sought refuge in the mountains, bringing with them a tapestry of superstitions and a fierce independence. Their world was one of small, self-sufficient communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, and family secrets were guarded with a zealous, often violent, loyalty. When Sheriff Brody began his investigation, he was met with a wall of silence. The faces of the locals were polite but unreadable. They offered him water and food but no information. They claimed to have seen nothing, heard nothing. The victims, Dr. Finch determined, were not from the immediate area. Their clothes, though worn, were of a slightly different make. Some wore shoes of a style more common in the flatlands. These were travelers, perhaps, or migrant workers who had vanished on the winding, treacherous mountain roads. People who had no family here to ask questions, no one to note their absence. The perfect victims. The well itself became the focus of the early investigation. It was old, hand-dug, and lined with fieldstone in a manner that suggested it was built decades earlier, perhaps by the original settlers of the hollow. But the land had been fallow for years. No one had lived near this clearing for a generation. It served no purpose. It was a forgotten place, or so it seemed. The location was unnervingly deliberate, far from any main path, yet not entirely inaccessible. It was a place one had to know about to find. A place chosen for its secrecy, for its ability to swallow the dead and keep them hidden from the living world. The mystery was deepening, and the silence of the hollow was becoming more menacing than any confession. As Dr. Finch conducted his grim autopsies in a makeshift tent, a more disturbing pattern began to emerge. The official causes of death were difficult to ascertain due to the advanced state of decomposition. Some showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, while others had no obvious injuries at all. It was possible they had been thrown into the well alive. But there was another, more unsettling detail that connected nearly all the victims. Around the necks of 12 of the 17 bodies, tangled in their clothes or clinging to bone, were small, hand-carved wooden symbols. They were crudely made, whittled from hickory branches, and all depicted the same strange effigy, a spiral coiling inward, with 3 lines radiating from its center. The symbol was unfamiliar to Sheriff Brody and his men. It didn't match any known religious iconography or fraternal order markings. When he showed one of the carvings to the local elders, they would shake their heads, their eyes refusing to meet his. A few would mutter about old ways or hill magic, but none would elaborate. It was a forbidden topic, a piece of a darker, more ancient belief system that persisted in the shadows of the Christian faith they publicly professed. This discovery shifted the investigation from a simple case of mass murder to something far more macabre. This was not the work of a common bandit or a madman. The careful placement of the bodies, the passage of time between the deaths, and now these ritualistic symbols, it all pointed toward a horrifying, methodical purpose. It suggested a ceremony, a dark tradition being enacted in the heart of the woods. The hollow well was not just a dumping ground, it was an altar. The 17 dead were not just victims, they were offerings. The investigation had stalled against a wall of communal silence, but the artifacts pulled from the well were beginning to speak a terrifying, silent language of their own. The news of the Hollowell murders spread slowly at first, then like a wildfire. Newspapers in Little Rock and Springfield ran sensationalized stories, painting the Ozarks as a savage, godless land of primitives. They called it the Well of Screams and the Arkansas Pit of Despair. The articles brought a wave of unwanted attention. Journalists, morbid tourists, and even self-proclaimed detectives descended on the quiet hollows, much to the resentment of the locals. The intrusion only served to harden their silence, their distrust of outsiders now validated. Sheriff Brody found his investigation complicated by the very people who were meant to help. The pressure from state officials was immense, demanding answers he simply did not have. The identities of the 17 victims remained a mystery. Without names, they were ghosts, their stories erased. Brody and his deputy, a young man named Cal, spent weeks canvassing the remote cabins and farmsteads, asking about missing persons, about strangers passing through. They were met with the same vacant stares and clipped, unhelpful answers. "Folks come and go," one old trapper told them, spitting tobacco juice near Brody's boot. "The mountains don't keep a roster." The case was turning into a legend before it was even close to being solved. Local children started daring each other to go near the well, which was now guarded day and night by one of Brody's men. Parents whispered of a curse, a darkness that had been disturbed. They said the well had always been a place of bad energy, a spot where the earth was thin, where things could cross over. These were the stories told around flickering hearths, the hushed folklore that the newspapers could never capture. It was the unwritten history of the mountains, and Brody began to suspect the answer to the murders lay within these forbidden tales, not in the rational world of evidence and clues he was accustomed to. Among the silence and fear, one family stood apart, the Pruitts. They lived deeper in the woods than anyone else, in a secluded valley accessible only by a treacherous, overgrown deer trail. The Pruitt clan had been in these mountains for generations, and they were regarded by their neighbors with a mixture of fear and reluctant respect. They kept to themselves, practiced herbal medicine that bordered on folk magic, and were known for their unsettling, pale blue eyes that all members of the family shared. They were rumored to be practitioners of the old ways, a pre-Christian belief system that centered on the land itself, on the power of the soil, the water, and the changing of the seasons. Sheriff Brody had heard the whispers about them, tales of strange rituals performed during the full moon, of livestock found bled dry in their pastures, of people who had crossed the Pruitts and then simply vanished. These were dismissed as campfire stories, the product of isolation and ignorance. But with 17 unidentified bodies pulled from a well less than 2 miles from their land, the stories took on a sinister new weight. When Brody and Deputy Cal made the difficult journey to the Pruitt homestead, they were met by the patriarch, Jedediah Pruitt. He was a tall, gaunt man with a long, white beard that did little to soften his severe features. He stood on his porch, a shotgun held loosely in his hands, and listened to the sheriff's questions without a flicker of emotion. He claimed to know nothing of the well or the bodies found within it. His family, he said, did not stray from their own land. But as Brody spoke, he noticed the same spiral symbol from the well, the one with the 3 radiating lines carved into the wooden lintel above the cabin's main door. It was old, the wood weathered and dark. Jedediah followed the sheriff's gaze and his lips tightened into a thin, hard line. "Protection," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Against what the mountains ask for." Jedediah Pruitt's cryptic words hung in the air long after Sheriff Brody and his deputy left the secluded valley. Against what the mountains ask for. It was not a confession, but it felt like a key to a lock Brody didn't understand. The symbol above the door was a clear link to the macabre scene at the well, Yet the patriarch had offered it up with a strange, defiant confidence, as if daring the lawman to comprehend its meaning. The encounter only deepened the mystery and solidified the Prout clan as the focal point of the investigation. But suspicion was not evidence. Brody had nothing to connect them directly to the crimes. No witnesses, no murder weapon, and no motive that would stand up in a court of law. The investigation was being suffocated by superstition and a communal code of silence. The official record of what happened next is thin, pieced together from forgotten letters and hushed testimony. If you want to uncover more forbidden histories like this one, consider subscribing, because the whispers from the hollow were only just beginning to reveal the true horror. The outside world was growing impatient. The sensational stories in the press were becoming an embarrassment to the state. The governor sent word: close the case. Find a culprit, any culprit, and restore order. Brody was under immense pressure to make an arrest, to provide a simple answer for an impossibly complex crime. He knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that the truth of the hollow well was not simple, and that the order he was meant to restore was just a fragile illusion in these ancient, secretive mountains. The well had been a secret for years, perhaps decades. The community had allowed it to exist. The question was no longer just who filled it, but why. Weeks turned into months, and the autumn of 1892 bled into a harsh, unforgiving winter. The snows came early that year, blanketing the Ozarks in a thick shroud of white and effectively ending the investigation. The treacherous mountain paths became impassable, isolating the hollows even further. The hollow well case went cold, frozen in time like the landscape itself. The bodies of the 17 victims, still unidentified, were buried in a mass grave in the corner of a churchyard in a nearby town, their wooden markers bearing no names, only numbers. They were forgotten by the world, but not by the people of Blackwood Hollow. The well was filled in with rocks and earth by order of the county, an attempt to literally bury the mystery. But it did little to erase the psychological scar. The clearing in the woods became a shunned place, a piece of land tainted by a powerful and unspoken taboo. Parents warned their children away from it, and hunters would make wide circles to avoid it, even if it meant losing their quarry. The place had become haunted, not by the spirits of the dead, but by the weight of a shared, unspoken secret. Sheriff Brody, defeated, returned to his office, the strange, spiral-carved effigy from the well sitting on his desk, a constant, mocking reminder of his failure. He had looked into the abyss, and a chilling, incomprehensible darkness had looked back. He couldn't shake the feeling that the horror was not over. The murders had stopped, or at least the discovery of them had. But the belief system that drove them, the dark tradition that demanded such a sacrifice, was still alive. It was dormant, hiding in the isolated cabins and silent valleys, waiting for the mountains to ask for something once more. For nearly 30 years, the story of the Hollow Well survived only as a local legend, a terrifying tale told to scare children. The official case files gathered dust in a courthouse basement, a closed chapter of a crime too bizarre and disturbing to be solved. Sheriff Brody passed away in 1915, taking his suspicions and frustrations to the grave. The world moved on. The Great War came and went, and the slow march of modernity began to creep into even the most remote corners of the Ozarks. New roads were cut, and families began to move away in search of work in the growing cities. The old ways, the deep-seated superstitions, began to fade with the aging generations. Blackwood Hollow became less of a community and more of a geographical location, its population dwindling. The Prout clan, once a formidable and feared presence, also seemed to wither. Jedediah Prout died sometime during the war, and his children, one by one, either died young from illness or simply vanished, moving away without a word. By 1920, the Prout homestead, once a place of intimidating isolation, stood abandoned, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the encroaching forest. The land was sold to a timber company, who saw only the value of the old-growth hickory and oak, oblivious to the dark history soaked into the soil. The well, long since buried, was a forgotten scar on the landscape. It seemed the secret of the 17 bodies would remain buried forever, a permanent and chilling mystery. But history has a way of refusing to stay dead. Sometimes, it waits for a new voice to give it life. And in the spring of 1921, that voice would come from a most unexpected source. Esther Mullins was a young folklorist from the University of Arkansas, part of a new generation of academics determined to preserve the unique cultural heritage of the Ozark region before it was erased by time. She traveled the mountains with a notepad and a patient ear, collecting ballads, ghost stories, and folk remedies from the elderly residents who still remembered the old ways. It was during an interview with a woman in her 90s, a distant cousin of the Blackwood family, that Esther first heard the story of the Hollow Well. The old woman, her mind a fragile archive of the past century, spoke of it not as an unsolved crime but as a known thing, a terrible necessity. She referred to the well as the feeding place or the tithe well. She spoke of a belief, old even in her childhood, that the land in that specific hollow was sentient, a hungry entity that demanded a price for its bounty. In years of drought or famine, the belief went, the land needed to be fed to ensure survival for the rest of the community. The people it took, she whispered, were wanderers, those with no roots, no ties to the land themselves. Their loss, it was reasoned, would not weaken the community. It would strengthen it. It was a horrifying paganistic concept, a survival creed twisted into a macabre ritual. Esther was captivated and horrified. This was more than just a ghost story. It was a potential motive, a cultural context for an inexplicable mass murder. The old woman also spoke of the Prutes. She said they were not the killers, not in the way an outsider would understand. They were the keepers, the ones who understood the land's needs, the ones who performed the rituals. They were the intermediaries between the people and the ancient, hungry earth. The murders, she implied, were not committed by a single family. They were a communal secret, a terrible burden shared by the entire hollow. Esther Mullins, armed with this chilling new perspective, began to dig deeper. She spent months poring over old county records, birth certificates, and death notices, cross-referencing them with her notes on local family histories. She was looking for a pattern, any anomaly that could corroborate the old woman's story. She found that in years of recorded crop failures, harsh winters, or outbreaks of disease in the late 19th century, there were often corresponding reports of lone travelers or migrant families going missing in that part of the county. These disappearances were rarely investigated with any rigor. They were footnotes in the ledgers, people who had simply been erased from history. But the most significant breakthrough came from an unlikely place, the abandoned Prout homestead. The timber company had begun clearing the land, and one of the loggers, knowing of Esther's research, had saved a small, leather-bound journal found tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the old cabin. The journal belonged to a woman named Elspeth Prout, Jedediah's wife. Its pages, filled with spidery, faded script, were not a diary of daily life, but a terrifying record of a hidden faith. Elspeth wrote of the hungry soil and the stone mouth, her name for the well. She chronicled the tithes given over the years, referring to the victims not by name, but by description. The railroad man with the silver watch, the family of 3 from the east, the young woman with the yellow hair. Each entry was accompanied by a hand-drawn sketch of the spiral symbol. The journal was the missing piece, the horrifying confirmation of the folktale. It laid bare a disturbing theology born of desperation, a belief system where human sacrifice was the ultimate act of preservation. The Prouts were not just killers, they were priests and priestesses of a dark and ancient creed. Elspeth Prout's journal was a document of profound and disturbing conviction. She wrote without a hint of remorse or guilt. To her, the acts were not murder, they were a sacred duty, a necessary transaction with the forces that governed their lives. She described how the victims were chosen. They were often lured from the main roads with offers of food or shelter, brought to the hollow under the guise of hospitality. They were observed, their connections to the outside world assessed. The ideal tithe was someone who would not be missed, whose disappearance would create no ripples. The journal detailed the rituals. The victims were often drugged with a potent herbal concoction made from local plants, rendering them compliant and disoriented. They were led to the well at dusk during a specific phase of the moon. The spiral effigy was placed around their neck as a mark of the consecrated. The final act, the giving, as Elspeth called it, was described in chillingly detached prose. There was no rage, no malice. It was done with a solemn, procedural air, like a farmer tending his crops. The journal also explained the timeline. The tithes were not taken every year. They were only required when the land showed signs of displeasure, a prolonged drought, a blight on the corn, a sickness that swept through the children of the hollow. The 17 bodies in the well represented nearly 4 decades of these sacrifices, a horrifying accumulation of the community's darkest secret. The last entry was dated the summer of 1892, just months before the discovery. It spoke of a sickness that had taken 2 of the Prout children. Elspeth wrote, "The soil is angry. The tithe was not enough. It asks for more. It asks for one of our own." This final, terrifying entry suggested the tradition was about to turn inward, that the system was beginning to collapse under its own weight. Esther Mullins now held the truth, but it was a truth almost too monstrous to believe, and one that was nearly impossible to prove in a legal sense. The main perpetrators were long dead. The community that had been complicit through its silence was now scattered and aged. To reveal this story would be to desecrate the memories of the dead and brand an entire region with the stigma of cannibalistic, paganistic ritual. She consulted with a history professor at the university, who urged caution. He argued that publishing the journal verbatim would lead to a modern-day witch hunt, punishing the descendants for the sins of their ancestors. The story of the hollow well, he advised, was a part of a forbidden history, a window into the extremes of human belief when faced with utter desperation. Its value was not in prosecution, but in understanding the dark capabilities of the human spirit. The story was a chilling reminder that the veneer of civilization is thin, and that in the face of annihilation, communities can create their own terrifying moralities. This case wasn't about a single monster, but about a monstrous idea that had taken root and been nurtured by a whole community. The horror was not just that 17 people were murdered, but that their deaths were seen as necessary by their neighbors. For a case to be truly cold, all hope of solving it must be abandoned. The Hollowell murders had been cold for decades, but what Esther discovered was far more disturbing than a simple unsolved crime. We unearth these banned stories to understand the darkness of the past. If you find this journey into forgotten history compelling, support our channel by liking this video, so these chilling accounts can reach others. What Esther chose to do with this forbidden knowledge would seal the fate of the Hollowell legend forever. Esther Mullins made a decision that would be debated by historians for decades. She chose not to publish Elspeth Prout's journal. She did not release the names or the explicit, horrifying details of the rituals. Instead, she wrote a heavily anonymized academic paper titled "Survival Beliefs and Syncretic Rituals in Isolated Appalachian Communities." In it, she described the theoretical framework of a folk belief system where the land was seen as an entity requiring appeasement, using the Hollowell case as a hypothetical example, stripped of its most sensational details. She disguised the location, changed the names, and presented the journal's contents as a collection of unverified oral traditions. She effectively buried the truth in plain sight, hiding it within the dry, academic language of folklore studies. Her reasons were complex. She felt a duty to protect the living from the legacy of the dead. She saw no justice in destroying a community's reputation decades after the fact. Perhaps she also feared that the story was simply too dark, too unbelievable for the world to accept. Or maybe she believed that some secrets are so fundamentally tied to a place that they should be left there, to be absorbed back into the land that created them. The original journal of Elspeth Prout was donated to the university archives under a strict seal, not to be opened for 75 years. The story of the Hollowell murders was officially closed, relegated to the footnotes of history, a macabre legend with no definitive answer. The world would remember it as an unsolved mystery, a chilling tale of a mass grave in the Ozarks. Only a handful of people would ever know the full, terrifying truth, that the monster in Blackwood Hollow was not a man but a creed, a belief, and that perhaps is the most horrifying kind of monster there is. The sealing of the Prout Journal in 1922 should have been the final word on the Hollow Well. The murders, explained yet unproven, receded into the mists of Ozark legend. The clearing in the woods was eventually consumed by the timber company's operations, the last physical traces of the well obliterated. But a curse, whether real or imagined, has a long memory. The land where the Prout homestead stood, and the tract containing the buried well, seemed to resist any attempt at being tamed. The timber company that bought the land was plagued by a string of bizarre and tragic accidents. Equipment failed inexplicably. Loggers were injured in freak occurrences. One man claimed to have seen a tall, gaunt figure with pale eyes watching them from the trees, only to vanish when he looked again. The company's profits from the tract were minimal, and after a series of financial setbacks in the late 1920s, they went bankrupt, abandoning their claim on the land. It was sold again, this time to a hopeful farming family from out of state who had heard nothing of its dark history. They tried for 5 years to cultivate the soil. Their crops failed repeatedly. Their livestock sickened and died. They reported a pervasive feeling of being watched, an oppressive weight that seemed to hang over their small farmhouse. Their 2 young children suffered from recurring nightmares of a dark hole in the ground, a hole that whispered their names. In 1934, they abandoned the farm, leaving behind most of their possessions, fleeing in the middle of the night as if escaping a living entity. The land was left to go wild once more, as if the mountains themselves were determined to reclaim this haunted patch of earth and guard its secrets. The local population continued to whisper. The failed timber operation and the fleeing farm family were seen as proof of the land's lingering power. They called the area Prout's Blight. It became a place on the map to be avoided, a geographical dead zone. Stories began to shift and evolve. The original, horrifying truth uncovered by Esther Mullins was forgotten, replaced by more traditional ghost lore. People spoke of the spirits of the 17 victims, forever bound to the place of their demise, unable to rest. Others claimed the ghost of Jedediah Prout himself guarded the woods, a skeletal sentinel protecting his family's dark legacy. These tales, while chilling, were a pale shadow of the systemic, ritualistic horror that had actually occurred. It was a more palatable version of the story, one that allowed for clear lines between the innocent dead and a single, monstrous villain. It was easier to believe in ghosts than to confront the idea that an entire community could be complicit in such a macabre tradition. Human nature often seeks to simplify horror, to contain it within a narrative it can understand. A haunted wood is a common trope. A community that sacrifices travelers to a hungry earth is a truth too disturbing to fit into conventional folklore. And so, the real story, the one locked away in Elspeth Prout's journal, remained dormant. The curse, it seemed, was not just on the land itself, but on the truth, condemning it to be forever misunderstood, cloaked in the more comfortable terrors of a simple ghost story. The true, cold case was not just about identifying the victims, but about remembering the horrifying reason they were chosen. In 1997, 75 years after its sealing, the Journal of Elspeth Prout was scheduled to be opened. The archivist at the University of Arkansas, a meticulous man named Arthur Vance, was aware of the document and its peculiar history. He had read Esther Mullins's paper and had always been intrigued by the heavily veiled references to the Hollow Well incident. He prepared for the unsealing with a sense of academic anticipation, expecting to find a curious but ultimately minor piece of regional folklore. He invited a small group of history and anthropology professors to be present for the event. What they found inside the archival box was not what they expected. The leather-bound journal was there, its pages brittle with age. But it was not alone. Alongside it lay a small canvas pouch. Inside the pouch were a dozen of the crudely carved wooden effigies, the spiral with 3 radiating lines, recovered from the necks of the victims in 1892. They had not been buried with the bodies or kept as evidence. Somehow, they had ended up with Esther Mullins, who had chosen to seal them away with the journal, binding the confession and the proof together. As Vance and the other academics carefully read through Elspeth's chillingly straightforward account of the rituals, the room grew cold. The academic detachment they were trained to maintain evaporated, replaced by a sense of profound horror. This was not folklore. This was a primary source document, a detailed confession to a series of ritualistic murders that spanned decades. The abstract, theoretical evil that Esther Mullins had hinted at in her paper was now laid bare in its raw, unvarnished form. The hollow well was not a legend. It was a historical fact of the most macabre kind. The unsealing of the journal created a moral and academic crisis. The professors were faced with the same dilemma as Esther Mullins 75 years earlier. What was the responsible way to handle this explosive, horrifying information? Publishing the journal now would undoubtedly create a media firestorm. It would drag the names of long-dead Ozark families through the mud, potentially inciting resentment and even violence against their living descendants, who were completely innocent of these ancestral crimes. The story was so lurid, so antithetical to modern sensibilities, that it risked being turned into a cheap Gothic spectacle rather than a subject of serious historical study. The debate among the small group of academics was fierce. Some argued for full transparency, believing that history, no matter how ugly, must be brought into the light. They contended that hiding the truth was a disservice to the 17 forgotten victims, who deserved to have their story told. Others argued for a more cautious approach, proposing a limited scholarly publication that would maintain the anonymization Esther Mullins had established. They feared the societal fallout, the digital-era witch hunt that would inevitably follow a public release. They argued that the journal's value was in the lessons it taught about human psychology and desperation, lessons that could be conveyed without destroying the lives of the innocent. In the end, a compromise was reached, but it was one that satisfied no one. They decided to digitize the journal and make it available in a restricted-access digital archive, available only to approved academic researchers. Once again, the full story of the Hollow Well was deliberately kept from the public. The truth was deemed too dangerous, too disturbing to be set free. Even with the journal hidden away in a restricted digital archive, fragments of the story began to leak. A graduate student with access to the files spoke to a journalist. An anonymous source sent photocopies of several pages to a local newspaper. The story that emerged was fractured, sensationalized, and often inaccurate. But the core elements, the ritual sacrifice, the hungry soil, the complicit community, entered the public consciousness, this time with the weight of academic discovery behind them. The legend of the Hollow Well was reborn, no longer a simple ghost story, but a verified American horror story. The land known as Prout's Blight became a destination for ghost hunters, paranormal investigators, and morbidly curious teenagers. The current owners, a land trust that had acquired the property in the 1980s and turned it into a nature preserve, were forced to gate the entrances and post "no trespassing" signs. It did little to deter the thrill seekers. People would sneak onto the property at night, holding seances, using Ouija boards, and trying to capture evidence of the supernatural. The site of the filled-in well, its exact location now lost to time and overgrowth, became a sort of macabre holy grail. Several self-proclaimed psychics claimed to have made contact with the spirits, reporting feelings of immense sadness and fear. The true horror, the cold, calculated, belief-driven nature of the murders, was once again lost, replaced by the cheap thrills of ghost hunting. The complex and terrifying history of Blackwood Hollow had been flattened into a tourist attraction, its profound darkness reduced to a campfire tale. The renewed interest in the case did, however, prompt one positive development. A group of forensic genealogists, intrigued by the leaked story, petitioned for access to the case files. Their goal was to finally give the 17 victims their names back. Using the scant physical descriptions from Dr. Finch's 1892 autopsy reports, and cross-referencing them with historical records of missing persons from across the region, they began the painstaking work of identification. It was a near-impossible task, a puzzle with most of its pieces missing. But after years of dedicated work, they had a breakthrough. They tentatively identified one of the victims, a young man named Samuel Hayes. Hayes was a traveling photographer from Missouri who had written to his sister in the spring of 1885 about taking a job in northwestern Arkansas. He was never heard from again. The description of his clothes and his physical appearance in the missing person report was a near-perfect match for Victim 9 from Dr. Finch's notes. The discovery was a small victory, a single name reclaimed from the darkness. It made the tragedy real in a way the anonymous number never could. Samuel Hayes was no longer just a part of a gruesome statistic. He was a person with a family, a profession, and a future that had been stolen from him in a dark wood for a reason he could never have understood. His identification served as a stark reminder that the victims of the Hollow Well were not abstract tithes. They were real people whose lives were sacrificed on the altar of a forbidden, terrifying belief. The genealogists continue their work to this day, hoping to give the other 16 souls the dignity of a name, a final act of remembrance against the overwhelming silence of the past. The story of the Hollow Well raises a disturbing and timeless question. How thin is the line between faith and atrocity? The community in Blackwood Hollow did not see their actions as evil. In the twisted logic of their belief system, they were performing a necessary, even noble, act of self-preservation. Their creed was forged in the crucible of extreme hardship. When faced with starvation, disease, and the constant threat of annihilation, they retreated into a dark pact with the land they depended on. It is a terrifying example of how isolation and desperation can warp a society's moral compass, allowing for unspeakable acts to be rationalized as the will of a higher power. This was not a cult of personality, driven by a single charismatic leader. It was a folk religion, woven into the very fabric of the community's existence. The Pruitts were not maniacal despots. They were the custodians of the tradition, the ones tasked with carrying out the terrible duties that others in the Hollow tacitly supported for their own survival. Their silence was their consent. Their refusal to speak to Sheriff Brody was their complicity. This communal aspect is what makes the Hollow Well case so profoundly disturbing. It's a cold case not just because the perpetrators died without facing justice, but because the crime itself was a function of an entire social organism. It forces us to confront the unsettling possibility that the capacity for such horror lies dormant not just in lone psychopaths, but in the collective human psyche, waiting for the right combination of fear, isolation, and belief to awaken it. The Hollow Well is a testament to the darkness that can flourish when the outside world is shut out. What of the symbol itself? The spiral with 3 radiating lines, carved into wood and stone, the emblem of this dark faith. Anthropologists who studied the images from the Pruitt Journal noted its resemblance to certain ancient, pre-Christian European symbols. The triskelion, or triple spiral, is found in Celtic art and is thought to represent concepts like life-death rebirth, or the connection between the physical, spiritual, and celestial worlds. It's possible that the symbol was a corrupted, half-remembered artifact brought over by the original Scots-Irish settlers of the region, its original meaning lost and twisted over generations into something new and monstrous. In the context of the Hollow Well cult, the symbol likely represented their core belief. The spiral could signify the well itself, the vortex into the earth. The 3 lines could represent the pact between the land, the community, and the sacrificed victim, a dark trinity that ensured the cycle of survival. It was their cross, their crescent, their star, a sacred image that to them represented not death but the guarantee of life. The fact that Jedediah Pruitt displayed it openly above his door was not an act of arrogance, but a declaration of faith. He was showing Sheriff Brody that he was protected by a power the lawman could not comprehend, the power of the hungry soil. The symbol is a chilling piece of evidence, a Rosetta Stone for a forbidden language of ritual murder, demonstrating how even sacred geometry can be perverted to serve the most macabre of ends. Its meaning is forever stained by the 17 souls it was used to condemn. Let us return to that final cryptic entry in Elspeth Prutt's journal. The soil is angry. The tithe was not enough. It asks for more. It asks for one of our own. This sentence suggests a terrifying escalation, a horrifying turning point in the cult's history. For decades, their system had worked, preying on outsiders to maintain internal stability. But in 1892, the system was failing. The sacrifices were no longer appeasing the land. The sickness that took 2 of their children was proof that their god, the earth itself, was no longer satisfied with the blood of strangers. It was now demanding the ultimate sacrifice, a member of the community, one of the faithful. This raises a chilling possibility. Could the discovery of the well by young Silas Blackwood have been an accident, or was it somehow deliberate? Is it possible that someone within the community, faced with the prospect of sacrificing their own child or spouse, decided to break the code of silence? Perhaps they didn't go to the sheriff, an act that would have been unthinkable, but instead orchestrated a discovery, leading the boy to the well to expose the secret and bring the cycle of violence to an end. It's a speculative theory, impossible to prove, but it reframes the narrative. The discovery of the well may not have been the beginning of the end for the cult, but the final, desperate act of an insider who could no longer bear the price the mountains demanded. Seen in this light, the hollow well is not just a story of a monstrous belief, but also the story of a silent, anonymous dissenter who chose to save their family by sacrificing their entire culture, their entire world. The legacy of the hollow well continues to haunt the region in subtle ways. It has become a part of the Ozarks' identity, a piece of its dark folklore that is both a source of shame and a strange sort of local pride. It is a story that sets them apart, a testament to the unique and sometimes brutal history of the mountains. The term Prutt's Blight is still used by some older residents to refer to anything that is inexplicably unlucky or cursed: a barren field, a sickly animal, a family plagued by misfortune. The spiral symbol, now widely known thanks to the internet, has been co-opted by various groups. It appears on t-shirts sold in tourist shops, as a tattoo on the arms of rebellious teenagers, and as an emblem for local heavy metal bands. Its original, terrifying meaning has been diluted into a generic symbol of macabre rebellion. This commercialization of the tragedy is perhaps the final indignity. The profound horror of the 17 victims, the chilling conviction of their killers, and the complex societal pressures that led to the atrocity have all been reduced to a brand. The story serves as a cautionary tale about how we consume and process historical trauma. We often sand down the roughest edges, simplify the complex motives, and turn the incomprehensible into a commodity. The true, disturbing case of the hollow well resists this simplification. It remains a stark and uncomfortable monument to a time, and a belief system that most of us would prefer to believe could never exist. But it did. And that is a truth no amount of commercialization can ever truly erase. One question that lingers is how the secret was kept for so long. How could 17 people be murdered over a period of decades without a single person breaking the silence? The answer lies in the powerful combination of isolation and fear. In the 19th century Ozarks, the official law was a distant and often untrusted entity. Communities policed themselves according to their own codes. To betray the community to an outsider like Sheriff Brody would be the ultimate transgression, an act that would lead to being ostracized at best and violently silenced at worst. Furthermore, the belief system itself was a powerful enforcement mechanism. If you truly believed that your child's survival depended on the tithe, you would not be inclined to stop it. You would see it as a terrible but essential part of life, like harsh winters or deadly diseases. The silence was not just a conspiracy. It was an act of faith. Anyone who harbored doubts would have been terrified to voice them, not only for fear of their neighbors but for fear of divine retribution from the land itself. What if they spoke out and the next season's crops failed? The guilt and the blame from the entire community would fall upon them. This psychological prison, built of fear, faith, and mutual dependency, was stronger than any jail cell. It ensured that the secret of the hollow well would be kept, locked away in the collective conscience of the hollow, until the system itself began to crumble from within. The silence was the bedrock upon which the altar of the well was built. The story of Esther Mullins herself adds another layer of complexity. She was a woman of science and reason, yet she came face to face with a belief system so powerful it drove people to commit unimaginable acts. Her decision to suppress the journal shows a profound understanding of the power of narrative. She knew that the story, if released into the world raw and untamed, would become a destructive force. Her actions can be seen as a form of curatorship, an attempt to control a dangerous piece of information and prevent it from doing more harm. In a way, she became the final keeper of the secret, not to perpetuate the ritual, but to contain its historical fallout. She took on the burden of the truth so that the descendants of those in Blackwood Hollow would not have to. It was an act of profound, if paternalistic, empathy. She recognized that the people of 1922 were not the people of 1892. They were the children and grandchildren, living in a different world, and did not deserve to be shackled by the horrifying legacy of their ancestors. Her choice raises difficult ethical questions about the role of the historian. Is their primary duty to the unvarnished truth, or to the living society that must reckon with that truth? Esther chose the latter. She chose compassion over revelation, and in doing so, she shaped the legacy of the Hollow well into a legend rather than a conviction, a haunting melody rather than a scream. Let us consider the well itself. A simple hole in the ground, a source of life-giving water transformed into a gateway to death. The symbolism is potent and deeply unsettling. Wells in folklore are often portals to other worlds, places of magic and divination. The stone mouth, as Elspeth Prout called it, was precisely that, a mouth for the earth, a place where the physical world could feed the supernatural entity they worshipped. The choice of a well was not arbitrary. It was a place that was already sacred, already connected to the deep, unseen forces of the earth. By filling it with their victims, they were not just disposing of bodies, they were delivering their offerings directly to the heart of their God. The inversion of the well's purpose, from a giver of life to a taker of it, is a perfect metaphor for the community's own twisted morality. They took the fundamental principles of survival and community and inverted them into a creed of ritualistic murder. The well became a repository for their fears, their sins, and their secrets. When the authorities filled it with stone and dirt, they were attempting to seal away the physical evidence. But they could not seal the psychic wound it had left on the landscape and its people. The memory of the well and the 17 souls it consumed seeped into the soil, becoming a permanent part of the place, a lingering stain that time has yet to wash away. The well is gone, but the hollow it created in the history of the Ozarks remains. Could something like the hollow well happen today? It's easy to dismiss it as a relic of a primitive, unenlightened past. We live in a world of constant connection, of satellite surveillance and digital footprints. It seems impossible for 17 people to vanish without a trace, for a community to harbor such a dark secret in the age of the internet. But the core ingredients that led to the tragedy, isolation, fear, and belief, are timeless human conditions. Isolation is no longer just geographical. It can be ideological, social, and digital. Small, insular groups, cut off from mainstream society and fed by their own echo chambers of radical belief, exist all around us. When a group's belief system becomes more important than the lives of those outside the group, the potential for atrocity is always present. The names and the rituals may change, but the underlying psychology is the same. The hollow well is an extreme example, but it serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers of absolute belief, especially when that belief is nurtured in the dark, away from the tempering influence of the wider world. It forces us to ask ourselves, what are the hungry gods we serve today? What are the necessary sacrifices we are willing to make for the sake of our own tribe's survival? The story is not just a macabre piece of history, it is a permanent and relevant warning. The narrative of the Hollow Well is ultimately one of absence. The absence of names for the victims, the absence of justice for the perpetrators, the absence of a clear and public resolution. The case file remains open in a metaphorical sense, a void in the historical record. We are left with fragments, a boy's terrifying discovery, a weary sheriff's dead-end investigation, a folklorist's suppressed findings, and a killer's chillingly calm confession. Putting these pieces together gives us a picture of what likely happened, but it is a picture full of holes, forever incomplete. We don't know the names of all the victims. We will never hear their stories, know their hopes and dreams, or understand how they came to be on a lonely Ozark road at the wrong time. We will never fully comprehend the internal lives of the Pruitts and their neighbors, the daily fear and conviction that allowed them to carry out these acts. We are left only with the chilling echo of their deeds. This lack of resolution is precisely what makes the story so haunting. It denies us the comfort of closure. The mystery, in a legal sense, is solved, but in a deeper, more human sense, it remains profoundly and permanently open. The 17 souls in the well remain prisoners of this ambiguity, their tragedy defined as much by what we don't know as by what we do. They are a permanent fixture in the landscape of America's darkest and most forbidden histories. The physical location of Pruitt's Blight is now a designated wilderness area, part of a state park. There are no signs or markers indicating the horrors that once transpired there. Nature has been allowed to reclaim it completely. The logging roads have long since vanished, and the forest is thick and impassable in many places. Park rangers and local historians know the general area, but they keep the information quiet to discourage the very kind of morbid tourism that plagued the site in the late 1990s. If you were to hike through those woods today, you would see nothing out of the ordinary. It is a place of quiet, natural beauty. The sunlight filters through the dense canopy, dappling the forest floor. Birds call from the branches of ancient oaks. A clear stream, perhaps the very one that fed the well, trickles over mossy stones. There is no monument, no plaque, no sign of the mass grave that once festered beneath the soil. And yet, some who walk those trails report a feeling of deep unease, a sudden, inexplicable chill in the air, a sense of being watched from the shadows. They speak of a profound and unnatural silence that sometimes falls over the woods, a silence where even the birds and insects seem to hold their breath. It is as if the land itself remembers, as if the soil, once fed with such a terrible price, still holds the memory of its dark sacrament. The horror is no longer visible, but it has become a part of the atmosphere, a psychic residue that clings to the very trees and stones. The case of the Hollow Well that hid 17 bodies is a story that operates on multiple levels of terror. There is the visceral horror of the discovery itself, the macabre sight in the well. There is the investigative horror of the mystery, the silent and unnerving community. There is the historical horror of the journal, the revelation of a systemic, ritualistic creed of murder. But perhaps the deepest horror is existential. The story dismantles our belief in a safe and rational world. It shows us a place where the rules of civilization were suspended, where a community created its own terrifying moral universe, completely divorced from our own. It reminds us that our modern world, with its laws and protections, is a fragile construction, and that dark, ancient things can persist in its forgotten corners. The Hollow Well is a tear in the fabric of American history, a glimpse into a primordial darkness that we pretend we have evolved beyond. The Pruitts and their neighbors were not creatures from another world. They were American pioneers, people not so different from our own ancestors. They were simply pushed to an extreme, and in that extremity they made a choice. The lingering dread of the story comes from this recognition. It is the quiet, chilling whisper that asks, faced with the same desperation, the same isolation, the same fear, what choices might we be capable of? What dark wells might we be willing to fill? The final fate of the Pruitt bloodline remains an enigma, a fittingly mysterious end to their story. After the journal's last entry, which spoke of the need to sacrifice one of their own, the family seems to have disintegrated. Local records show no further births or deaths attributed to them. They simply stopped. Did the sickness mentioned by Elspeth wipe them out? Or did the horrifying new demand of their faith, the command to turn on each other, cause the belief system to shatter, leading the survivors to flee the cursed land and scatter to the winds, changing their names and erasing their past? Perhaps the most chilling possibility is that they fulfilled the ritual one last time, that the final body to go into the well before its discovery was a Prout, a sacrifice made to save the family, which ironically ended it. We will never know. Their homestead rotted back into the earth, their stories faded into whispers, and their unique pale eyes vanished from the hills. They are like a lost tribe, their entire culture of ritual and sacrifice rising to a fever pitch, and then vanishing completely, leaving behind only a filled-in well and a legacy of profound and unsettling darkness. Their disappearance is the final, silent testament to a creed so monstrous it ultimately consumed itself, leaving the Ozark Hills to keep their secrets. And in the deep woods of the Blight, under the silent watch of the ancient trees, the land remains hungry, and it remembers.